Today I wanted to talk about some thoughts that I had while reading this book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, The Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War, Eric Foner. For those of you who are interested, this is one of the many books, I think about 60, that I bought after reading the bibliography of Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men about the Civil War, which is an excellent book on the Civil War. I highly recommend anyone interested in the topic who doesn't know that much about it, or even people who do, to read that book and to pay very close attention to the bibliography and investigate any of the books that he recommends. He describes each of the books and what it offers and what's good and what's bad about it. And like I said, I think I purchased between 50 and 60 books about it. Um, I've kind of been alternating between books on the antebellum period and just any other books, just to not be bored. And I know for a while I didn't read this book. I thought, I don't, doesn't seem that sexy, doesn't seem that interesting, but I thought it was important, so I went ahead and read, and I'm very glad that I did. Much of it is actually surprisingly relevant to today, because what the book is basically about is the breakdown of the second political system in the United States. You know, in the first half, or at least the second third, or the middle part of the 19th century, you have the second political system in the United States, where you have basically the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. And these parties gradually broke down. Now, of course, the two parties had disagreements between them, but there were other bigger issues on which they didn't have sectional parties. So the big issue, of course, is slavery. The Whigs didn't have a consistent position on slavery, and initially the Democrats didn't have a consistent position on slavery. What started to happen, and it switched back and forth, if you looked at the rhetoric and the political ideology of the two parties, there were elements of Whiggism that lend itself to slavery, and there are elements of democracy that lends itself to slavery. However, depending on which ones you emphasize, either one could have potentially become pro or anti-slavery. What ended up happening is the Democratic Party became a Southern pro-slave party. Not that this was necessarily what was going to happen, or that this was the only way it could have played out, but that's how it ended up happening. And you had a situation where the Whig Party, which was not exclusively a Northern party, was not willing to cope with this. The Whigs were nationalists, and they did not want to see there be a sectional conflict. They certainly didn't want there to be a civil war. And so even though slavery was this very big, very important issue, most Whig leaders felt that the best thing they should do is try and ignore it. So this is people like Clay and Daniel Webster, people like this who maybe they had very strong views about slavery personally, but they thought for the good of the country, and for their other nationalistic goals, which Whigs tended to have pretty nationalistic goals, that it should be ignored. But this was very frustrating for anybody in the North who really cared about slavery, or indeed anyone in the South who really cared about slavery. You were offered, on the one hand, one party that was basically for slavery, and on the other hand, another party that just did not want to have a stance on the issue at all. And this caused a lot of problems. Now, it also caused a problem with Northern Democrats, or indeed Southern Democrats, who had views on slavery that differed from those of the majority of the party. Like I said earlier, there wasn't anything inherently about the Democratic Party in the 19th century that made it the ideal place for slave owners to go. In fact, the Democratic Party was in many ways more rhetorically egalitarian. And that's a whole other interesting video there. If you ever study the Jacksonian era, it doesn't come across as, well, this is obviously the party that slave owners would join. You'd almost put it more on the Whigs. However, that's not what ended up happening. But then you have people in the Democratic Party who are not pro-slavery, who are not necessarily pro-South. Indeed, there are many Democrats in the North who are suddenly confronted with the fact that they are in a party that is mostly their main issue. Its number one priority is the promotion of an institution that you may actually find abhorrent. So there were several attempts to create parties that would deal with the slavery issue, or deal with some other issue that would not be sectional. So you have things like the Free Soil Party, you have the Know Nothings, who are basically an anti-immigrant party, and these organizations tried to do one of two things: either to find an issue other than slavery that they could unite around, so that, maybe Southerners and Northerners could both unite in anti-foreign bigotry, and then they would forget about slavery. And this is kind of what the Know Nothings, the Know Nothings really cared about immigration and things like that, and they had actually some pretty pertinent things about immigrants being able to vote and stuff. But one of the main arguing points for the Know Nothings was, here, this is something we can all gather around and agree with, and we won't have to fight about slavery. And then you have things like the Free Soil Party, which are very similar, or just say, well, instead of ignoring slavery, we should have a party that directly addresses slavery. And you have the Free Soil Party, and then you have the Republicans. And basically the Republicans said, okay, we have all these other issues that we care about. It's, the tariff, nationalism, infrastructure, cronyism, basically adopted most of the policies of the Whigs, to be honest, and said all those are important, all those matter, but we have to address the slavery issue first. Now, most Republicans, when they said address the slavery issue, did not mean abolishing it in the South. They meant stopping its spread, stopping things like the fugitive slave law, those sorts of things. Maybe ending it in the District of Columbia, that sort of thing. But it needs to be addressed. Because right now there's this bitter struggle between the North and the South versus who's going to have power. And the way they would do that is who's going to have the more slave states or free states. Who's going to decide all this territory in the West that's going to become states sooner or later? Are they going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? And both sides basically concluded that for them not to become a minority, they would have to have it be either slave or free. And this caused enormous conflict, an increasingly acrimonious series of compromises and political debates that went on and on and on and on. And every time a compromise was reached and then broken, and not to take sides too much, but it was very often the South saying, okay, no, we don't want just determination now. We want everything south of this line. Okay, well, now we have a compromise, but we want, yeah. Every time that happened, more and more people would become convinced that the slavery issue needed to be addressed. And eventually the Republicans were the party that emerged that seemed most able to do that. And not only were they just Whigs, though, all the Northern Democrats who were anti-slavery or had more egalitarian ideas fled to that party. And a lot of those people actually, after the Civil War, went right back to being Democrats. So I think this is interesting because today we see a somewhat similar situation. Now, it's not perfectly analogous. There are many big, huge differences. So I don't want to say that, well, because this is what happened in the 1850s, we can project that that's going to be what happens now. But I think it is an area worth study and fascinating in its parallels. One thing I think that should be pointed out, as libertarians, we have all these very strong moral intuitions or moral arguments and all these things that we find morally outrageous that we kind of rail against, almost to the point of being Cassandras. I don't think that based on this book and based on what I see happen with people, that alone is enough to cause a political realignment or cause any big changes, because strict moral arguments are just not that persuasive with the average person. Moral arguments only really matter if they have strong utilitarian consequences for people. There's only a certain amount of the population that with whom strict moral arguments resound very well. And I mean, there is there are some people you make the argument and they'll just go, yep, I agree, NAP, I understand, and I know libertarians who are like that, and they tend not to have the best understanding of reality because reality isn't that important. I mean, to the extent that morality and ethics relate to the real world, reality is important, but it's kind of devil come what may, I don't care, you can't violate the NAP. And although I appreciate that sentiment, and there's a lot to be said for it, it's just not that compelling to most people. Very interesting, in the book, they talk a lot about Salmon P. Chase. If you don't know who Salmon P. Chase was, he is more like the anti-slavery, more progressive Republican that people kind of think Lincoln was, but actually he wasn't. Lincoln was much more of a moderate, much more pragmatic, much more of a nationalist. He did have views about slavery. He thought slavery was wrong, but he wasn't going to abolish it in the South, and he was willing to go a long way to keep the South in the Union, as far as anyone really would. Salmon P. Chase was much more of an abolitionist. and he had been railing against the slave power and slavery for many decades before the Civil War. He eventually became the governor of Ohio and then served as the Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln, I believe, during the war. And there's a couple of interesting quotes from Chase in the book, basically where he talks to other abolitionists. And he's like, look, we have been railing against the evils of slavery for 20, 30 years in the North, and it's just not compelling to people. Yeah, they might shrug and say, I agree, slavery is wrong, it's bad, but the world is full of iniquity. There's evil and wrong and injustice all over the world, and what do you want me to do about it? I have my own life I have to live, and the evils that are happening here, there, or someplace else, if it's in Africa, if it's in Asia, or if it's in Mississippi, is not something that I really need to worry that much about. What did have traction was when slavery was viewed as an existential threat to the North and to their way of life. When it was couched in terms of the slave power, some menacing organization of plantation owners in the South conspiring to take control of the federal government and then use the federal government to spread slavery not only into the territories, which presumably over time would lead to a overwhelming slave majority in the country, to actually making slavery legal in the free states. Now, how accurate or correct or plausible that scenario was, if it was real, it was a legitimate threat, and an increasing number of Northerners began to see it as real because of a couple of major events that happened. Probably the two biggest were the series of compromises that were reached with the South. They always wanted more, so they have the Missouri Compromise, then they have the Kansas-Nebraska Compromise, they have the Wilson Proviso, and then you have things like the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case basically involved a slave going and living in a free state for several years. He said basically, I'm free now because I live in a free state, and the Supreme Court, under Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, interesting man, Roger Taney actually manumitted all of his own personal slaves, so I'd be fascinated to learn more about this guy's ideas. But said, you don't have any rights as a black man, none that a white man is bound to respect. And you know, the average Northerner was very racist, didn't like blacks, didn't want to basically live with blacks. They wanted segregation, they wanted separation. Many of them wanted blacks to be colonized, to be sent to Africa or to Latin America, or at least to stay in the South. They were barred from many northern states, especially in the West, and even in New England, which was probably the most progressive of all the places in the North. They faced all kinds of civil restrictions and persecutions, you know, probably as bad or worse than the Jim Crows were in the South, you know, in the postbellum period. That said, none of them wanted slavery in the North, and yet how can there be freedom in the North if a black man can live in the North for several years in a free state and still be a slave? That was an alarm bell for many people in the North to be like, this is an actual threat. This is not just morally wrong. This is actually something that threatens my livelihood. Your average Northerner, a yeoman farmer with his own private property, with his own farm, who's trying to make it as a petty capitalist, as an entrepreneur, felt threatened by a slave oligarchy. And the other big event was the fugitive slave law. Again, you have slaves that are in the North that are being sent back, and it was viewed as an example of the slave power taking over the federal government and using it to spread the ideology of slavery. And there became a very strong defensive reaction against this that eventually was harnessed by the Republican Party. And again, there have been several other parties that have tried to do this: the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, the Union Party, the Know Nothings. The Republicans were the first to do it really well and really branch out. Like, slavery is a big threat to you. If you own a farm in Michigan, if you own a farm in New Hampshire, if you own a business, it's a threat to you. All right. If we don't confront the slave power at the federal level, then they're going to take over the federal government, the presidency. They're going to admit more slave states in the territories until they have larger majorities in both the House and the Senate, at the very least in the Senate, if not the House directly. And they'll be able to ram through the legalization of slavery everywhere in the United States. The slave power, for its part, felt very strongly that it was necessary for the federal government to be pro-slavery, that slavery as an institution could not exist without direct subsidy from the federal government. And this is actually something that many abolitionists agreed with the slave owners on. It's fascinating when, again, when we have all these arguments that like, oh, slavery, free market, blah, 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 completely false. Slavery, and especially slavery in the context of the United States, utterly dependent on not only being subsidized by local governments like municipalities and states, but by the overarching federal government. This was the view both of the abolitionists and of the slave owners, which is an interesting insight that's overlooked by so many social justice warriors today and anti-libertarian bigots. However, that said, the point is, it wasn't until slavery was a threat, or at least perceived as a threat, that it became a real issue. Nobody was going to vote for a Republican. No one's going to risk a conflict with the South. Nobody's going to give two shits about abolition until they feel that they're actually at stake. And I just wish that people like Stefan Molyneux and those other of his ilk out there would understand that it's not good enough to just say this is morally wrong in the abstract. Sure, that's great for some people, but for the average person, they need to know more than that. They need to know that it's going to hurt them, or that they can profit from its collapse. So I think that's one of the chief insights of studying the antebellum period is. The other thing, though, I think I should point out is, although I think there are analogies with the 1850s to today, there are some huge differences. One, the political parties today have become exceedingly non-ideological. They're not very rhetorical. They're not consistent, and they're not principled. They don't have a coherent platform. They don't have a coherent ideology. Both parties basically have very foggy, very vague rhetoric that they use interchangeably, and that is very much on purpose. If a politician, if a political party has a definite political ideology that's heterodox, it's very explicit, it's much easier to hold them to task. It's much easier to be like, oh, you believe in X, Y, and Z, and yet as in office you do A, B, and C, you're obviously full of shit. And they can call them out much easier. If you have vague logic, if a Democrat can be pro-war and a nationalist, and a Republican can be pro-big government and pro-regulation, then they can get away with anything, and that's exactly what's happening. We don't have a slavery issue. There are issues that we care about. There are important issues, just that there were other important issues back then. People cared about the tariff. People cared about the rights of immigrants, whether they could vote or not, how long it would take. You had people like the Know-Nothings saying that even after someone became a naturalized citizen, they should have to wait 21 years before they could vote, versus other people who thought they should be able to vote right away. Obviously, there were things that people disagreed with. Homesteading, there were lots of issues that people could disagree about, but there was one overarching huge issue, and that was slavery. Today, I don't think that I see that. It's not healthcare. It's not gun control. It's not the wars. Democrats are perfectly fine with wars. I mean, when there's a Republican office, they use it as a rhetorical attack. Maybe they'll march and play their drums, but they're not really motivated by that very strongly. This may have been true in, say, the Vietnam period, but it's not now. So there isn't really this galvanizing single issue that can really piss everybody off and make people say, I have to pick sides. And so people aren't, and it's just easy to kind of waver between the two. They're so similar that there's not a lot to really fight about. I mean, and that's another thing, is like so many of the arguments are just so superficial and so ideologically unstimulating. This is why I have a hard time, like I can't watch the debates. It's very hard to listen to politicians because the stuff that they offer is so plain and imprecise and non-specific and vague. There's nothing you can really like, and inconsistent. I mean, one minute they all are chameleons when it comes to this, with very few exceptions. Yes, the Dennis Kuciniches, or maybe the Bernie Sanders, not even the Bernie Sanders, but the Ron Pauls. But we're talking about less than 1% of the politicians like that, and certainly none of the powerful ones. Even someone like Rand Paul, can talk either way, and you don't know what stuff he believes and what stuff he doesn't believe, and so you can't really hold him against him. Whereas in the 1850s, a Republican was you knew if he was for slavery or not for slavery, and he couldn't come out. I mean, in some ways, like the Republicans who even didn't want there to be a war almost had to have there be a war because their rhetoric implied that. Because they believed in union so much that they couldn't just let the South go. I mean, I think morally they should have let the South go, but like in terms of the rhetoric, they had to, and in terms of the politics of the time, if they had come out and not, and that's just one example, withholding the union, um, uh, or at least preventing the spread. Let's say not as dramatic an issue, but like the Republicans always opposed spreading slavery into the territories. And one reason compromise was impossible after Lincoln was elected is because one of the things that Southerners wanted as a compromise was to allow slavery to extend into the territories. And no Republican could allow that because that's what they had campaigned on. And it would have been too obvious and too blatant, too hypocritical for them to go back on that they basically stubbornly, if you want to call it that, or you could say it, more principled, went into war with the South. And nowadays, politicians don't have that level of ideological conformity. They don't have to do what everyone else thinks. They don't have. There's not negative consequences if they flip flop, if they change their position. So I don't think that we're in the same place. What is similar is there's a lot of disaffection. There are a lot of people who don't like both parties, who think that they're both worthless. Depending on the issue, they don't think that they're addressing them. Now, if you're a Republican or a conservative, you might think they're not doing enough about the debt. They're not doing enough to repeal Obamacare. They're not doing enough about the wars, and usually that's in a bad sense because a lot of the conservatives just think that they should be doing even more than they already are. If you're a Democrat, I mean, maybe you think that there's too much inequality and you just really want all these politicians who get all their money from Goldman Sachs to try and stop inequality. But it's again, it's not very strong. And I think another problem is that because of capitalism, because of our wealth, at the end of the day, like you're still going to get fat. I mean, like in the 1850s, if you were a yeoman farmer in the Midwest and you wanted to say move, it really bothered you if there might be slaves where you're going to move. It would make a big impact into whether you decided to or not, or whether you could prosper or not. And and on the contrary, slave owners, it mattered. Their livelihood depended on it directly in that case. And so there's much stronger incentive to become active in politics and to have a political ideology and to stick with it and to vote by it and to agitate for or against it. Now it's like, well, you can be Democrat or you can be Republican. You're still going to have to be able to watch Game of Thrones tonight and go see Captain America and have a nice bed. Unfortunately, although I think that the amount of improvement that we could have in society is enormous, that on the margins on every issue we could do better than we are, and that the cumulative effect of that would be quite profound, quite dramatic. It's not so blatantly obvious, and it's not the difference between starvation and prosperity. It's the difference between prosperity and more prosperity. We don't have anything that's posing an existential threat. As much as they want to pretend like ISIL or ISIS is an existential threat, it's not. And so there isn't an issue that we can all latch upon and be like, this is it. It's not the debt, it's not guns, it's not healthcare. Until something really big happens. And I think the only thing that's been close would be like the economy. The economic crashes in 2008 or like the Great Depression. I think these are things that could potentially galvanize the population more. The only problem with them is that in order to understand them, you have to do a lot of reading and a lot of research. And I don't mean necessarily that in order to agree with the Austrian, theory of the business cycle, just to say it's not. You can look at an economic collapse and draw completely divergent conclusions, and in fact, people have done that. So yes, the Austrians called it, and they, have their theories about, why the collapse happened. But you have the Pikettys, and you have the Marxists, and you have the Keynesians, and they're going to look at it and draw, polar opposite conclusions. And the average person in the street, it's hard for them to tell. Now, I will say that there's been a big upswing in libertarianism and in Austrianism, and I think a lot of this, one of the big reasons, that might be the biggest reason, other possibilities would just be the spread of the internet and Ron Paul, was the collapse. And a lot of people said, what caused this? They went out and looked. And I've met lots of people over the years who were ambivalent, who didn't really care, who were just Republicans or just Democrats, and they became curious about what had happened. And it didn't take too long before they stumbled across basically the libertarian analysis of the event. And next thing you know, they're anarcho-capitalists. But I think that having a coherent alternative political philosophy is good, and we have that. It's just interesting, and I think the left has as well. The left has their Marxism, they have their socialism, they have their democratic socialism, or whatever they want to call it these days, that they also offer as an alternative. Now, I think that history has tainted those a great deal. The 20th century has shown the failures of socialism at so many levels. The radical Marxism, I think, is not an alternative, um, practically speaking, for most people. However, nanny state, welfare state, socialism is national socialism is, and I think that's one of the alternatives we may see. Now, I'm not projecting there's another collapse. Obviously, there will be. I just don't know when. So I'm not saying that as a forecaster or as a predictor, only as someone who says it's likely to happen because it has happened in the past, and there's no reason to assume it can't happen again. But other than that, or some other major catastrophe, I don't know what it will take to really galvanize lots of people, or cause lots of people to start searching for solutions. As slavery became more and more an issue, more and more people started making the conscious effort to find some way to address the problem, and eventually the Republicans came to power to fill that niche. Um, Now, I think libertarianism has that potential, but I don't know if there's an issue that will match it. I don't know if that will be able to appeal to the most enough people. I think that there's large problems. So many people have been indoctrinated against libertarian intuition. Um, Although it's a mixed bag. There's certain libertarian ideas that are very common, that are very popular, that are very persuasive, that many people are amenable to. On the other hand, there are many ideas that basically people think of as anathema, that have been tainted through demagoguery to the point that they're almost toxic. It's almost a non sequitur. It's almost a non-starter to talk about property rights and being able to deny people access to your business based on the fact that it's your business. People just automatically assume that you want to reinstitute slavery if you say that, and or at least many people do. So it's an interesting area to study. I was glad I read the book. I do recommend it. It's not very long. It's only 317 pages, and I think there are certain similarities, although again, not perfectly analogous by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, just thought I'd put it out there, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.